All right, everyone. Well, good evening. Welcome to the Native Plant Symposium. This is our third event for this particular season. It's really wonderful to have all of you here. Again, I'd really encourage you to, type things into the chat. Let us know where your garden is and what you're looking forward to this spring. Before we introduce our first presenter, I first want to welcome you on behalf of all of the group of us who've been planning this workshop. My name is Maria Genoviak. I am Michigan State University Extension Master Gardener and a board member on the Keweenaw Land Trust. And my co-conspirators in this effort include Marcia Goodrich, Jill Fisher, and Jeannie DeClerc. And we have been planning this event for the past 4 years in terms of a partnership among Keweenaw Land Trust, Keweenaw Wild Ones, the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, and the Keweenaw Garden Club. So it's really great to have you here. This is the third in a series, and so the other presentations have been recorded. We will get them up online. There are links there, but we'll get them up online in terms of YouTube videos within the next week, including tonight's presentation with Brian Black. We've had a bit of a change in our plans where unfortunately Nancy Lawson is not going to be able to make it to be give us a live presentation this evening. She had some family issues come up. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have Brian Black's presentation on sustainable gardening. And then Nancy was kind enough to share a recorded presentation that she has on a very similar presentation than what she was going to give us. And so we'll play a recording of that if we can make the technology work, and we should be able to. And then we'll reschedule her for a live presentation when she's available later, because I know a lot of people were really interested and excited to have that, that coming up. So I'll pause and see if there are any other items of business from my co-planners, and then turn it over to Marcia Goodrich to introduce our speaker.
Right. Thank you very much, Maria. I know I'm sorry that Nancy isn't going to be able to join us, but our Wild Ones chapter is going to work to have her come and give a different talk, and we will let everybody know when that happens. Now, our first speaker, who we're about to hear from, began his college career as a chemical engineering student, which is, how on earth did that even happen? And quickly realized that his heart wasn't in figuring out how to produce agricultural chemicals in the most efficient way possible. 2 decades and a PhD in ecology, evolutionary biology, and behavior from Michigan State University later, he joined the faculty of Bay College in Escanaba. In his 20 years as a biology instructor, Brian has earned the Bay College Outstanding Educator Award 3 times. He oversees the Bay College greenhouse, propagating a variety of plants to support campus and area school gardens, as well as our Wild Ones native plant sale, which is coming up later this summer. His yard is a testament to how much wildlife habitat you can cram into a small urban lot, and a perfect example of sustainable gardening, which is the topic of his talk tonight. Welcome, Brian Black.
Oh, thank you, Marcia. I am thrilled to be here, and I wanted to reinforce a couple of the things that you said. My training and background are in ecology, evolutionary biology, and I teach general biology, ecology, and evolution pretty exclusively, which is to say I'm just an avocational gardener, and my experience there is really just from the joy of watching plants grow. That said, I've been managing the Bay greenhouse for 20 years, and trying to make as good a use of it as possible for the community, which includes starting as many native perennial wildflowers as possible. I've been a Wild Ones member for about 20 years as well, and shortly after I came to Escanaba, I got connected with folks who are really interested in sources for native plants. And so I've been pushing native plants all over the UP ever since. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get started. So I presume everything's all right, and if it's not, you'll let me know. As we mentioned, I'm an environmental science instructor more than a gardener, and so my spin on gardening has to do primarily with sustainability. And sustainability is, I think, something we're all increasingly aware of, and it allows me, even in the context of a discussion about how to have fun in your yard, to bring in the broader context of what it means to be human on our planet today. And necessarily, forgive me, it requires a bit of doom and gloom as we launch our discussion here. We'll begin with a look at a brief definition of sustainability. I'll welcome you to the Anthropocene and talk about the unintended consequences of human dominance of our planet. I'll try and keep that very brief because it is depressing, and get us on to sustainable garden design and sustainable gardening practices as quickly as possible. So broadly speaking, sustainability has been defined as meeting the needs of our present generation and fellow species that we share the planet with without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. If you look at the ecological economics or environmental science literature, beginning in the 1980s, you'll find suggestions that the human ecological footprint, in fact, exceeded Earth's carrying capacity about that time. And so essentially, we are living on borrowed time. That has led over the last decade or so to a very dynamic and engaging conversation in geological sciences about when and whether to designate a new geologic age, an age of man, if you will, what they're calling the Anthropocene. Sustainability then, in the gardening context, encourages us to protect and restore and enhance the ability of landscapes to provide the ecosystem services that benefit both humans and other organisms. And just a note here, that's my yard, a small city block in Escanaba, 50 feet by 170 feet, where I practice most of my sustainable gardening. This is an issue for us today, of course, because at the root of the problem is the number of people on Earth. And really this circumstance is something that arose within the lifetimes of all of us very nearly. What's been called the Great Acceleration really began after World War II as developed nations worked to ensure that all people on Earth had access to basic medical services, clean, safe drinking water, and really had astonishing success at preventing premature death from infectious disease, malnutrition, and so forth. The unintended consequence of that, of course, is that all these infants were no longer dying. And as a consequence, they're here, they have needs, and we're working very hard to meet those needs for everybody. I'd point out also that in the developing world, fewer people than ever, as a proportion of the human population, are failing to meet their basic needs. So we have been astonishingly successful at ensuring that as many people on Earth have access to food, safe drinking water, basic shelter, and can in fact live a healthy and normal human lifespan. Unfortunately, there have been some unintended consequences of our dominance of the planet. It begins, the other big one of that everybody thinks about and is aware of today is climate change. But what I really want to stress as we talk about gardening is that there are many, many dimensions to sustainability and to the practices that we can all pursue in order to minimize our impact on the planet. In addition to climate change and biodiversity loss, human alteration of biogeochemical cycles, in particular the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, is extraordinary at this point. The amount of nitrogen circulating in the biosphere is several orders of magnitude higher than prior to human impacts. We're rapidly depleting phosphorus availability through mining. That phosphorus very often then ends up in runoff, in streams, in lakes, and ultimately in the ocean. And the agricultural community has begun to recognize that phosphorus limitation is likely to be a real problem in the coming decades. Land use change, of course, is profound. I think the statistic that is most noteworthy there is that there's a tenfold increase in the rate of global sedimentation rates. That means the amount of good soil that ends up on the bottom of the ocean, in rivers, is truly unprecedented in terms of Earth's history. Freshwater access is, of course, an issue for many communities. We're blessed in where we live, but almost certainly going forward, many political conflicts. Other issues include the stratospheric ozone, an environmental problem that is in fact appears to be getting better. Most recent data suggests that the size of the ozone hole over the South Pole is less than it has been in over 30 years. North Pole stratospheric ozone loss has not slowed as much, but we're hopeful that that will change. Ocean acidification is directly linked, of course, to greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, reducing the pH of the ocean, and combined with the warming of the waters, creating major stresses for aquatic ecosystems. And finally, environmental scientists recognize a whole suite of potential other challenges to sustainability that have not yet been quantified. And that leads to a concept called planetary boundaries, which is a tool that has been used to sort of assess where we're at in terms of our impact on Earth's ecological support systems. And the four I'd like to really emphasize today, as we switch to talking about gardening very shortly, are the really dramatic loss of biodiversity, in particular genetic diversity, climate change impacts on ecosystems, and the biogeochemical impacts on nitrogen and phosphorus availability. These are all areas that I think we need to be particularly conscious of as we practice our gardening. Climate change models in particular are something I think we need to reflect on as we plant plants in our yards, in our gardens. The concern is a significant loss in food production in many of our most productive agricultural areas. Climate change also impacts biodiversity loss, loss of forests, the intensification of weather and storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, and the associated sea level rise, the spread of tropical diseases to more temperate regions, and then a variety of impacts on human communities, including economic disruptions and climate migrants or refugees, which I would not be at all surprised to see arriving in our neck of the woods in the coming decades. So it's alarming, it's concerning, but it provides a context, I think, for us to talk about gardening. One of the first questions we might ask is, where should you garden? And when I'm asked this, I always just say, wherever you're at, you can grow plants. And in fact, in terms of our ecological impact on the planet, it's really best if you can live in a city and have your garden in that context. The analysis suggests that all other things being equal, urban dwellers have ecological footprints that are less than half of people who live in rural areas or choose to live in rural areas. So there are tremendous opportunities, I think, to help to develop livable communities. And one of the things that our gardening practices can do is contribute to that. So my talk's divided into two remaining sections. First, we'll talk about design principles and some of the things you can think about as you put space to use, and then some of the practices in our gardens. 6 topics. We'll talk about lawns, native plants, growing food, that is vegetable gardening, permaculture, energy crops, and solar and wind gardens.
This is cool.
I guess regarding lawns, I would suggest in a word that you simply should not have a lawn. Lawns in a broad context are ecological deserts, waste extraordinary quantities of water, fertilizers, use of pesticides and herbicides. I see a dark green lawn this time of year as they are popping up all over town right now, and it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. There's nothing sustainable about a lawn. I'm not opposed to a grassy field or a path, but I really don't like lawns. Best in your gardening practices if you're not devoted to feeding yourself to plant native plants. And we could spend an entire session talking about the benefits of native plants for our gardening. They provide habitat for a variety of native wildlife, enhancing biodiversity in our communities. I was suggesting to the organizers before we got started that someday I'm actually going to make a list of all the plants in my yard, but even more interesting, I think, would be the list of amphibians and insects and a variety of other critters that have turned up over the years. Native plants are adapted to our communities, and so they don't require water once they're established. No chemical inputs or fertilizer inputs are required. And of course, if you're part of this symposium, you're aware that Wild Ones is a sponsor, and I just put in a plug for Wild Ones as an extraordinary source for information about good sustainable gardening practices and how to select and choose appropriate plants for your yard. The connection I'd like to emphasize when it comes to native plant gardening is that it really does draw an extraordinary diversity of wildlife to your yard, not just the birds and insects that we're most familiar with seeing, but even in the middle of Escanaba, I've seen half a dozen different amphibian species and a variety of things that take up residence around the yard. And it's important to recognize that these insects are not just utilizing the habitat, they're providing significant benefits for us in terms of pollinator service, as well as being significant predators for many plant pests if you're also trying to grow food in your sustainable garden. In addition to native perennial wildflowers, there's a variety of woody shrubs and trees that can provide additional benefits for you as part of your sustainable garden. Deciduous trees on the south side can provide shade and as a consequence, reduce your cooling load in the summertime. Potential to provide yourself with maple syrup or service berries or perhaps hazelnuts. Although my hazelnuts and service berries mostly seem to feed the waxwings and the squirrels, and very few of them make it into my stomach, unfortunately. Conifers are also an important part of a healthy native community, in particular as shelter for the diversity of birds and insects that will almost certainly find your garden. On the north side, conifers can be really beneficial as a windscreen for our sometimes ferocious northern winters. Avoiding native plants, or excuse me, avoiding invasive plants is an important consideration as you think about designing your sustainable garden. And here's just a few of the most invasive native plants in Escanaba, a few of these in the Keweenaw as well. Water is an important consideration, of course, when you're gardening, and the use of rain barrels or rain gardens is an optimal way to use the precipitation that falls. When you need to supplement water, especially in the case of a vegetable garden, there's amazing drip irrigation systems. I've been researching one for my yard most recently, trying to get away from soaker hoses, which are not very efficient and hard to control in terms of getting the water where it's most beneficial to plants. Gray water is also suggested often as a component of your water resources that can support your sustainable garden. There are, of course, public health concerns about that, so I would encourage you to research gray water carefully if you intend to use that to support your gardening. Feeding yourself, I think, is one of the most important things we can do to contribute to sustainability. The reality today is that we eat petroleum as much as we eat actual foods. If you look at the energetic costs of our modern industrial agricultural system, and anytime that we can go out into our yards and harvest good, healthy food, we're short-circuiting that astonishingly unsustainable and really abusive practice associated with industrial agriculture. As Michael Pollan suggests, you should be feeding yourself mostly plants. And in your garden, the optimal way to maximize productivity really is a raised bed. There are many folks who are much more expert on discussing raised bed development design than I am, but I'll show you a couple of pictures here. And then permaculture is a topic that with a friend I've begun to research a little bit. He's far ahead of me in this regard. He has 40 acres outside of town, and the idea with permaculture is to develop a landscape that includes both annual and perennial plants, woody shrubs, and trees that all together contribute to providing resources for our lives. Here's some of my raised beds in the backyard. I've struggled a lot with raised bed design over the years, trying to minimize my expense while maximizing the amount of bed space. Mostly I've used cedar in the past, recommended to use FSC certified lumber. The Forest Stewardship Council ensures sustainable practices in our forest harvesting. The beauty in my experience with raised beds is that there's no soil compaction, so I don't ever have to do any tilling. And once the weed seed bank is depleted after a year or two, there's really minimal weeding required to maintain my beds. Poultry is a topic, which you might want to investigate as part of your sustainable practice. They will eat lots of your food waste. They're really beneficial pest control, providing fertilizer for your garden. And of course, they can feed you either with eggs or poultry as well. I have a couple of friends who live outside of town who've become very reliable suppliers of poultry to my family. Unfortunately, Escanaba has ordinances that prevent me from developing a chicken coop in my backyard. A few notes about permaculture. The upper Midwest here has a number of sites where this food forest model has been developed. A guy named Mark Shepard in Viola down in southwest Wisconsin has perhaps the most interesting developed permaculture site. And if this at all catches your imagination, I'd encourage you to pursue it a little bit, do a little further research. I'm not sure what it would take to establish a permaculture farm or yard in our region. We deal with a little bit more challenging weather than in southwest Wisconsin, but there's real opportunities here to through a mix of diverse vegetation to enhance habitat while at the same time providing food and resources for our families. Biomass is a topic that's worth mentioning here in the UP. We do have lots of trees and people burn wood for heating. We are fortunate to live, I think, in a part of the world where the forest resource can contribute to the sustainable heating of our homes. And some communities are doing cogeneration or heating of commercial or industrial facilities now with wood. The MSU Forest Biomass Innovation Center outside of Escanaba here has had a 20-year research program looking at hybrid willow and poplar as biomass energy crops on marginal farmland. And they've found that fiber for thermal energy production can be produced at 6 to 8 times higher rate than on native forest lands. The beauty of this then is that we can use marginal lands that really are not sufficient soil quality to continue an agricultural practice and use them to produce fiber for heating our homes. Investing in solar and wind resources, I think, is also worth mentioning, and they do call these farms. Hence, I thought it was appropriate to mention that as part of your sustainable practices, if you can contribute to your community solar farm or wind farm, that would be fantastic. Finally then, let's talk a little bit about sustainable practices when we're in our yards. First and foremost, my sustainable gardening practice dictates that fossil fuels are off limits, and so gardening than perhaps for many folks. I look at my garden as my gymnasium in that regard, and so instead of burning fossil fuels, I'll exercise my muscles to get the work done. Avoiding synthetic fertilizers, chemical inputs, invasive species. And then as basic practices, composting and mulching, I think, are absolutely critical to sustainable practice in our gardens. Finally, I'll wrap things up with a few comments about saving seed and really focusing on growing our communities. So I look at my gardening practice as my daily, weekly, and annual exercise routine, and truly take advantage of every opportunity to get out and get fresh air and exercise. And I think that's a key component of a sustainable practice. Not, of course, the fossil fueled implements and tools that so many think of when they think about gardening practice. I was absolutely flabbergasted. We had a late snow in March, and my neighbor was out blowing the snow off with his leaf blower. It was just excruciating. There are many alternatives to pesticides to control the pests that often would like to share your vegetable garden produce. And the great benefit of having a diverse native community in your yard is that you do attract those beneficial insects, the spider communities, the ladybugs, the lacewings, and so forth, which help keep the insect pests down, as well as attracting the pollinators that ensure good service for things like cucurbits and tomatoes and things. Amphibians and dragonflies also contribute to pest control. Herbicides, of course, are quite useful if you have a weed problem, but again, I would assert they're not sustainable in that regard. And a good weeding practice can ultimately put yourself out of a job over the years as you deplete the soil seed bank and end up with soil that has a minimal weed load. Once you've pulled your weeds, of course, to minimize the germination of a new round of seeds, you want to get your compost or mulch in there. I have a 3-yard compost bed where I move the compost from bin to bin as it matures. I fill all 3 of these bins to overflowing every year in my 50 by 170 foot yard. Absolutely no organic matter leaves my yard. Everything ends up in the compost bins. And over the course of a year, all of that organic debris from the yard reduces down to about 1 yard of compost from my garden each year. I also extensively, when I prune, use all of the cuttings as mulch for pathways and my perennial beds. All of the deadheads and end of the year vegetation in my perennial beds, I just use a clipper to trim down into 3 to 6 inch lengths, and they then form the mulch bed that keeps the subsequent year's weeds from germinating. Saving seeds is something that truly everybody should enjoy. Legumes and peppers and tomatoes are all super easy to save seed if you're gardening. Simply dry them out, put them in a bag, throw them in your refrigerator, they're ready to go for next year. And in fact, I do the same with all of the perennial wildflowers that I produce at the greenhouse at Bay. Almost all of my seed now is harvested from my yard. I don't have to go seek out native populations at this point for seeds. The challenge with harvesting wildflower seeds is you have to be there at the right moment. They're of course adapted to disperse. And so you got to be there. I usually walk around the yard with a few envelopes in the evening, beginning in July and August, and about once a week, I'll collect whatever's becoming ripe, let them dry for a week or two, and then again, they go into the vegetable drawer in my refrigerator, ready for planting the following season. So to wrap things up, I'd like to be a little radical in suggesting that by encouraging you to practice sustainable gardening practice is rather subversive in the context of our commitment to growing economies, as is, you know, the mantra of any politician, of any political stripe these days. Ultimately, I think our sustainable practices can get us away from the consumer economy, recognizing that we really don't need all that stuff, that our communities and our yards can provide us with much satisfaction and many of the things that we need. So with that, I would encourage you to share these ideas with each other, to enjoy your gardening community. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my passions here.
Great, Brian. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm going to encourage people to, we have some time. So, ask your questions. I pulled a few kind of from the notes to get started, but do feel free if you have any other questions to chat them in, and we can have about 5 minutes of Q&A. So I was looking through the questions, Brian, and I have a theme. That theme, 3 questions about dead wood. So first, for Marcia and anyone else who wants to grow salamanders, if you want to grow salamanders, do you have any thoughts on how you might go about doing that, or what kind of habitat features you might include?
Well, I think it needs to be shady and moist, and you need a lot of coarse woody debris. Coarse woody debris is ecological speak for logs and brush, and I don't know. I certainly wouldn't anticipate finding salamanders in town, but if you've got a pond or a water garden, potentially that would also contribute to salamander habitat.
Yeah, I was thinking about how when I was in forestry school, we used to do salamander surveys by just putting a board in the woods. So if you have especially like a wooded edge or something, just putting down a plain board or finding a log and popping it up. So there was also a question about hugelkultur when you were talking about permaculture, and that's probably a term that is not as many people are familiar with. And so, if you want to just describe it a little bit, and whether you've tried it or whether you've kind of seen any interesting uses that you have on your wish list, I think people might be interested in that.
What was the question again? I was looking at the chat to see what the questions were there.
Oh, these were kind of up a little ways higher. So had been a question about hugelkultur.
I am not familiar with hugelkultur. Never heard of it.
Okay, that would have been a question from what was it? From David. It's in the permaculture materials in terms of basically incorporating dead wood into like raised beds to aid in decomposition and organic matter integration.
So you could probably get some fungi going there as well.
Yeah, probably. All right. Great. And so here's one. We'll switch over to seed saving then. Can seeds be stored in a freezer instead of the fridge? So if you want to talk a little bit about after you collect and process your seeds, how would you recommend people save them?
So I have always heard it recommended that just the vegetable drawer or the crisper drawer in your refrigerator is the optimal habitat for those. There are most, I would think that most seeds would do just fine in the freezer, but there may be a few natives where the cold desiccation of the freezer is probably not optimal for their survival. One of the challenges I should note with saving native wildflower seeds is that most native plants have significant dormancy in their seeds. And what that means is that in any given year, often it's just a very small fraction of the seeds that will germinate. As a consequence, you can collect enormous quantities and some years end up with only a few seedlings. Whereas other years, for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, you can have almost complete germination. So there's a little bit of variability there. I would recommend the Prairie Moon Nursery and their website as key resource for both seed collecting, seed storage practices, and then most importantly, really stratification practices for different species. There are many species that if the seeds fully dry out, they simply won't ever germinate. And so those are species where it's really optimal to get them into some soil, even if it's just in a pot in your garage for the winter. They really need to be in a very native environment like they would experience in the wild in order to have very good germination. Blue flag iris are an example of that. If you collect seed from that around here, almost impossible to get them to germinate if they dry out fully. They really need to be moist all the time. Many species require simply cold stratification, and so storing the seed in your refrigerator provides that. Some species will germinate after 30 days, others require 60 days of cold stratification. Many more require cold and moist stratification, and so even when I collect seed, I will initially dry everything, but then 30 or 60 days ahead of when I plan to plant things, I'll add some moist sand to the seed in a Ziploc bag and stratify them in a cold, moist environment for whatever recommended time is.
Great. I got at least 2 more questions here. Someone's asking about replacing non-native trees with native species. They have a European horse chestnut. What would be your opinion on replacing it now with a white oak, rather than letting it live out its life? And I don't know where in the Midwest they are, but.
Yeah. I like trees, and honestly, I have some non-native trees in my yard. The ones that are invasive, however, I'm working very hard to get rid of. And in our community, it's the Norway maples that are invasive. I don't think a horse chestnut is going to be invasive. I suspect that their nuts provide a really good resource for a variety of wildlife. And so I personally wouldn't be in any great rush to eliminate something that's not really causing any harm. I'm not a purist, I should add. If that offends anybody, I apologize for that.
No, I think a lot of people here are definitely interested in really wide range of gardening. All right, and then last kind of 2 related questions is on raised beds. How wide and what kind of soil do you use?
So the secret to useful raised beds is not making them too wide. You need to be able to reach to the middle. So 3 feet is generally the recommended width there. I have a couple of beds that are 5 feet wide and I hate them. I have a couple 2-foot wide beds and they're great, but they make less efficient use of the space overall because then you have to have paths in between them. So 3 feet is probably a happy compromise where it's relatively easy to reach to the middle of the bed. Yeah. In terms of soil, in Escanaba here, our soil is sand. And at some point, I presume somebody trucked in some topsoil in my yard to actually create something that could grow some grass or whatever they wanted to grow. As I converted my yard to beds and put in a deck, I consolidated all the topsoil that was underneath the deck and in the pathways between the beds into the beds themselves. And so my raised beds are a foot or so high, and my soil largely came from my yard, from the paths between the beds. water retention is a real challenge in our community, but I don't have an easy access to clay to add to my garden beds. So I had lots and lots of compost and work it in, and the more organic matter I've managed to build up over the years, the better the water retention capacity is. But my soils are pretty droughty, unfortunately.
Great. Well, I'm looking at other folks who are hosting, but I think we've gone through a number of questions and this was really fantastic. Yeah, thanks to everyone. We will be posting presentations from this online, and so I'll post the URL shortly. But yeah, thank you, Brian, so much for joining us and for giving us just a really great talk. It was really great and lots of ideas and good eye candy, and your garden looks great.
Oh, thank you. It's fun to be here.
Great. All right. Well, next up, we are going to try to pipe in a recorded presentation from Nancy Lawson, since she wasn't going to be, since she isn't able to be here, and we will try and reschedule a live presentation, but she did offer up a recording. And so, Marcia, I'm going to have you talk a little bit about how, kind of introduce Nancy a little bit if it's okay, and maybe a highlight or two from the book club while I kind of work on the technology side of things. If you could find me some time, that would be fantastic. Just a minute or two. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Okay. Well, I'm really sorry Nancy can't be with us tonight. She's